Okay, so deep breath. I need to tell you about the most insane 3 weeks of my life. And I mean insane. Like I accidentally married a vampire duke and his dead ex-fiancée is my great aunt who's been cock-blocking him from beyond the grave for 127 years insane. This ring, this stupid, beautiful, cursed ring, it ruined my life. Then it saved it. Then it almost killed me. And now I'm a duchess who can apparently talk to ghosts, and my husband drinks blood from wine glasses like it's totally normal. But let me start from the beginning. 3 weeks ago, I was Luna Sterling, 27, broke as hell, specializing in cursed bridal antiques, which is exactly as depressing as it sounds. I had exactly £3.47 in my bank account, a repo truck parked outside my flat, and a stack of overdue bills that could literally bury me alive. And then I saw the ad. So there I was, scrolling through the Antique Trade Weekly newsletter at 2 a.m., because that's what my life had become, when I see this classified ad buried between Victorian mourning jewelry and hunted chamber pots. Clears her throat, adopts posh accent. Seeking immediate faux fiancé for social season, must appear aristocratic, discretion essential, no romantic expectations. £50,000 compensation for successful completion. £50,000 for pretending to be engaged to someone for a few months? I mean, I've had worse relationships that lasted longer and paid me nothing. So I'm thinking, what's the worst that could happen? Laughs bitterly. Famous last words, right? I fire off an email, professional, confident, totally lying about my aristocratic connections. I mean, I deal with antique wedding dresses for a living, so I know how to curtsy and which fork to use for the fish course. How hard could it be? 2 days later, I get a response. Not an email. An actual parchment letter delivered by a guy in full Victorian footman costume in 2024. In London. The neighbors thought I was filming a period drama. The letter just has an address, Blackmore Castle, somewhere in the countryside, and a time, 3 p.m. sharp. It's signed A. Dragomir, 9th Duke of Blackmore. Duke, an actual duke, wants to fake marry me. Now, I should have Googled this guy. I should have done literally any research. But $50K was sitting there like a golden ticket, and my landlord was already changing the locks. So I showed up. Picture this. Me, in my only clean blazer, which had a tea stain I tried to hide with a brooch, pulling up to this massive, gothic castle in my dying Honda Civic. The place looked like Dracula's summer home. Gargoyles, fog, the works. I'm talking proper horror movie establishing shot vibes. The front door was about 12 feet tall and made of wood that looked older than civilization. I knocked and it swung open, creaked and everything. Very atmospheric, very ominous. And then I saw him. Stops pacing, gets dreamy look. Alaric Dragomir was... Okay, you know how Benedict Cumberbatch is already unfairly attractive? Imagine if he was taller, paler, had cheekbones that could cut glass, and looked like he'd been carved from moonlight by angels with very specific preferences. Dark hair, sharp jaw, these incredibly intense gray eyes that seemed to look right through you. He was wearing a perfectly tailored black suit. And not modern black suit, I'm talking Victorian-era tailoring with the waistcoat and everything. The man looked like he'd stepped out of a Bronte novel. But here's the thing, and I should have paid attention to this. He was standing in shadow, like deliberately avoiding the sunlight streaming through the windows. Shakes head. Hindsight, am I right? So he looks at me for a long moment, and I'm standing there in my Converse sneakers and stained blazer, feeling like a complete fraud, when he says, and his voice is like dark chocolate and whiskey, "Miss Sterling, you're precisely on time. I appreciate punctuality." Then he hands me a contract. Not like a modern contract. I'm talking actual parchment with wax seals and everything. It looked like it belonged in a museum. The terms were pretty straightforward. 1 social season, approximately 3 months, separate bedrooms at all times, public appearances as his fiancée, no personal questions about his past or dietary habits, 50,000 pounds upon successful completion. Dietary habits. I thought maybe he was vegan or something? Laughs. The no personal questions clause should have been a red flag the size of taxes, but I needed that money, so I signed with an actual quill pen because apparently everything about this guy was unnecessarily dramatic. That's when he showed me to my room, and I got my first real look into the inside of the castle. It was like stepping into a gothic romance novel. Everything was dark wood and rich fabrics, oil paintings of stern-looking aristocrats, and way too many mirrors for comfort. But beautiful, hauntingly, impossibly beautiful. My room was bigger than my entire flat, with a 4-post bed that could sleep 6 people and windows that looked out over misty moors. There was even a vanity with all kinds of antique jewelry and perfumes laid out. And that's when I saw it. The ring was sitting on the vanity like it had been waiting for me. This absolutely massive emerald surrounded by diamonds set in silver that looked almost black with age. The kind of ring that belongs in a vault, not casually left on a dresser. But here's the thing, and I should have paid attention to this. I couldn't touch it. Not like it was cursed or anything dramatic. I mean, physically, every time I reached for it, it would slide away from my fingers, like it was on ice, but the vanity was completely dry. I mentioned it to Alaric at dinner that night, and his face went completely white. Which, considering he was already pale enough to be a vampire... Wait, I'm getting ahead of myself. "That ring," he said, setting down his wine glass with a shaking hand, "belongs to my late fiancée, Lady Evelina Blackthorne. She passed away in 1895. Late fiancé, who died over a century ago when he looked maybe 35 at most. But I was so focused on the money that I didn't ask the obvious questions. I just nodded sympathetically and changed the subject. Big mistake. That night I couldn't sleep. The bed was comfortable enough, but there were these sounds coming from the library downstairs. Page turning, footsteps, the occasional sigh. I figured maybe Alaric was a night owl. Around 3 a.m., I decided to grab some water and maybe check out the library. I've always been a book person, and from what I'd seen, his collection was incredible. I crept downstairs in my pajamas, pushed open the heavy library door, and there was a woman sitting in the reading chair by the fireplace, translucent, glowing slightly, wearing a Victorian wedding dress, and very clearly dead. She looked up from her book, Pride and Prejudice, because of course, and gave me the most withering look I've ever received in my life. "Finally," she said in this crisp, aristocratic accent, "someone with sense arrives at this God-forsaken castle, though I must say your nightwear is rather scandalous, dear." I screamed. Obviously. You would too. She just rolled her eyes. "Oh, don't be dramatic. I'm Lady Evelina Blackthorne, and we need to have a little chat about that ridiculous man you're pretending to marry." So that's how I met my husband's dead ex-fiancé. while wearing Hello Kitty pajamas and having a complete mental breakdown. Turns out, Lady Evelina had been haunting Blackmore Castle since 1895, when she died under mysterious circumstances right before her wedding to Alaric. She'd been stuck there, unable to move on, because, and this is where it gets really weird, the emerald ring was still on her finger. Her ghostly, translucent, very much dead finger. "The ring binds me here," she explained, holding up her hand. The emerald glowed with this eerie green light. "And as long as I'm bound to this place, Alaric remains weakened. A half-strength vampire, if you will. Powerful enough to maintain his noble facade, but weak enough that sunlight still burns him." Vampire. She said vampire like it was the most normal thing in the world. "Wait," I said, because my brain was trying to process all of this. "Vampire. Like actual vampire with fangs and blood drinking and..." "Oh yes, dear. Didn't he mention? Alaric is a 300-year-old vampire. The 9th Duke of Blackmore, Lord of the Night Court, and absolutely hopeless at relationships. This is his 3rd attempt at marriage." 3rd attempt. Great. But here's where it gets really insane. Evelina starts asking me about my family, my background, my genealogy. Turns out, she was fascinated by my last name, Sterling. "Sterling," she mused, tapping her ghostly chin. "There was a Sterling family I knew once. Clara Sterling, lovely girl, had the most beautiful daughter. What was her name? Ah, yes, Catherine. Sweet Catherine with her dark hair and green eyes. My great-great-grandmother was Catherine Sterling. I had her photograph in my wallet, a family heirloom my mother had passed down." When I showed Evelina the photo, she gasped. Actually gasped, which is impressive for someone who doesn't technically breathe. "That's my dear friend Catherine, which means..." She looked at me with wide eyes. "Oh, this is rich. This is absolutely perfect. You're my great-great-grandniece." So, let me get this straight. I accidentally agreed to fake marry a vampire duke to help him break free from the ghost of his dead ex-fiancé, who turns out to be my long-lost great-aunt, who's been cock-blocking him from beyond the grave for over a century. My life had officially become a supernatural soap opera. But wait, it gets better. Because Aunt Evelina, and yes, she insisted I call her Aunt Evelina, had opinions about this whole arrangement. £50,000, she scoffed. "Darling, your family. Family doesn't get paid off. Family gets the real prize." She held up her hand, the emerald ring catching the ghostly light. "This ring has been in our family for generations. It chooses its wearer based on true love and pure intentions. The reason it won't come off my finger isn't because I'm dead, dear child. It's because Alaric and I were never truly meant to be. We were arranged by our families, bound by duty, not love. But," she continued with a sly smile, "the ring has been humming ever since you arrived. Quite loudly, actually. I haven't been able to concentrate on my reading." Humming. The family heirloom was humming because it liked me. This was either the most romantic thing that had ever happened to me, or I was having a complete psychotic break. Honestly, both seemed equally likely at that point. The next morning, Alaric found me asleep in the library, slumped over a pile of genealogy books that Aunt Evelina had helpfully pulled out for me. When I woke, he was sitting across from me with this concerned expression. "You spoke with her, didn't you?" he said quietly. I nodded, still groggy. "She's my great aunt, apparently." His whole face changed. Relief, hope, something that looked almost like joy. Then you understand about what I am, about why I need the ring. Yeah, she explained. You're a vampire, she's a ghost. The ring is keeping you both trapped in some kind of supernatural stalemate. Got it. He stared at me for a long moment, then started laughing. Actually laughing, and the sound was so warm and genuine that I felt something flutter in my chest. Most people, he said, run screaming when they learn the truth. Most people don't need 50,000 pounds to keep their lives from falling apart, I replied. But even as I said it, I realized that wasn't entirely true anymore. Something had shifted in the night. Some fundamental change in how I saw this whole situation. Maybe it was meeting Aunt Evelina, or learning about my family connection to this place. Or maybe it was the way Alaric looked at me like I was something precious and unexpected. But the money was starting to feel less important than other things. That's when the real preparation began. Because apparently, fake marrying a vampire duke isn't just about showing up and looking pretty. There's etiquette to learn, society events to attend, and a whole supernatural world I needed to navigate. Alaric became my teacher, and those lessons were when I started falling for him. He taught me how to waltz in the castle ballroom, his hand on my waist, guiding me through steps that were older than countries. He showed me how to distinguish between different types of supernatural creatures at social events. The ones with 2 sharp teeth are probably vampires. The ones who smell like wet earth are likely fae. And if someone's eyes reflect light like a cat's, they're definitely werewolves. He explained vampire politics, the complex hierarchy of the night court, and why this engagement was so important for his standing in their society. But it was the quiet moments that got to me. The way he'd unconsciously moved to shield me from sunlight streaming through windows. How he'd pause mid-sentence when he caught me looking at him, like he couldn't quite believe I was real. The careful way he'd hand me things, making sure our fingers didn't brush, not because he didn't want to touch me, but because he was afraid he might hurt me. And the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, like I was something miraculous that had wandered into his dark, lonely world. 3 weeks into this arrangement, we attended our first major social event, a charity gala hosted by the London Supernatural Society. I was wearing a vintage emerald gown that perfectly matched the family ring, which was still firmly attached to Aunt Evelina's finger, and Alaric was in full formal wear. We looked like we belonged together. Hell, we felt like we belonged together. The gala was, well, imagine the most elegant party you've ever seen, except half the guests don't show up in mirrors, and some of them have wings. The supernatural elite of London all gathered to raise money for something called the Daylight Integration Project. I was actually enjoying myself, talking to a lovely vampire countess about antique jewelry, when the evening took a turn. A photographer from the supernatural gossip magazines, yes, those exist, snapped a picture of Alaric and me dancing. But in the photo, something was wrong. The emerald ring that should have been on my finger was missing, and instead there was this faint green glow around Alaric's hand where he held mine. The photo made the morning edition with the headline, "Duke's New Duchess, Common, Ringless, and Suspiciously Mortal." Goodness. Supernatural society is apparently just as catty as regular society, except with more death threats and actual cursing. The backlash was immediate. Other vampire families started questioning Alaric's judgment. The night court demanded proof that our engagement was legitimate and binding. And suddenly, our fake relationship had real consequences. That's when Alaric told me the truth about what he was really up against. He has given me an ultimatum, he said that evening, pacing the library while Aunt Evelina watched from her chair with interest. The night court has given me an ultimatum. Either I prove this engagement is real and binding by the autumn equinox, or I forfeit my title and lands. Okay, I said, trying to stay calm. What constitutes proof? He looked uncomfortable. The marriage must be consummated under the equinox moon with the family ring on your finger. Consummated. Right. And if you lose your title? I asked, though I was pretty sure I didn't want to know the answer. 400 vampire refugees lose their sanctuary. Families who fled persecution in other countries, children who were born here and know no other home, they'll all be exiled or worse. That's when I learned the real reason Alaric needed this engagement. It wasn't about his ego or his standing in society. Blackmore Castle wasn't just his home. It was a sanctuary for supernatural beings who had nowhere else to go. The title came with ancient protections, wards that kept the castle safe from those who would hunt or harm its inhabitants. Without the title, without the marriage, all of those people would lose the only safe haven they'd ever known. Suddenly, my 50,000 pounds seemed pretty insignificant compared to 400 lives. That night, I made a decision that surprised even me. I told Alaric I wanted to renegotiate our contract. The money, I said, keep it, but I want the truth. All of it. About Evelina, about how she died, about why this ring won't let either of you go. He was quiet for so long, I thought he might refuse. Then, slowly, he began to tell me a story that explained everything. Evelina and I were arranged to marry in 1895, he began. Our families had been allies for centuries, and the union would have strengthened both our positions in supernatural society. She was beautiful, intelligent, everything a duchess should be. But, I prompted, because there was definitely a but coming. But we didn't love each other. We were friends, companions, but there was no passion, no deep connection. The ring sensed this. It began to reject her, sliding off her finger at the worst moments, refusing to resize properly, sometimes disappearing entirely, only to reappear somewhere else in the castle. Aunt Evelina, who had been listening from her chair, nodded sadly. The ring was trying to tell us we were wrong for each other, but we were too stubborn to listen. The night before our wedding, Alaric continued, Evelina came to me in tears. She said she couldn't go through with the marriage, not when she'd met someone else, a mortal man, a scholar who worked at the British Museum. She was going to run away with him. So what happened? I asked, though I was starting to piece it together. She tried to remove the ring one last time. But because I was trying to force it off, trying to reject what I thought was my destiny, the magic backfired. Instead of freeing me, it bound me here permanently. My body died, but my spirit remained, tethered to this place by the very ring I was trying to escape. For 127 years, Aunt Evelina had been trapped, and Alaric had been living with the guilt of her death. He blamed himself for not stopping the arranged marriage, for not seeing how unhappy she was, for not being the kind of man she could truly love. The ring chooses based on true love. It has to be freely given and genuinely felt. That's why it won't come off my finger for Alaric, because what we had was duty, not love. And it's why it won't go on your finger while this engagement is fake. But here's the thing. By that point, 3 weeks into living in this crazy, magical, supernatural world, my feelings weren't fake anymore. I was falling in love with Alaric Dragomir. Hard. I loved the way he'd spent hours teaching me vampire history, his eyes lighting up when he talked about art and literature and music. I loved how gentle he was with the refugee families, how he'd remember every child's birthday and every adult's favorite book. I loved the dry humor that would slip out when he thought no one was listening, and the way he'd unconsciously hum old ballads while he worked in his study. I loved how he looked at me like I was the answer to a question he'd been asking for centuries. And I was pretty sure he was falling for me too. The way he'd find excuses to spend time with me, teaching me things I didn't really need to know. How he'd pause in doorways when he heard me laughing with Aunt Evelina, like the sound was something precious he wanted to memorize. The careful way he'd say my name, like it was a word he wanted to practice getting perfect. But we were both too scared to admit it. Him, because he'd spent over a century believing he was incapable of inspiring true love. Me, because falling for a 300-year-old vampire wasn't exactly in my 5-year plan. That's when Aunt Evelina decided to take matters into her own ghostly hands. Enough, she announced one evening, materializing in the middle of our very awkward dinner. I have been stuck in this castle for 127 years, watching two people dance around their feelings, and I refuse to watch it happen again. She looked at both of us sternly. Luna, darling, you're in love with him. Don't deny it. I can see your aura, and it's practically glowing pink whenever he's in the room. And Alaric, you absolute fool. You have been in love with her since the moment she walked through those doors wearing those ridiculous shoes. Aunt Evelina, I started to protest. No protests, she said firmly. The equinox is in 2 days. The night court will be here tomorrow to witness the ceremony and ensure it's legitimate. If you two don't figure this out, everyone loses. The refugees lose their home, Alaric loses his title, and I remain stuck here for another century. Then she smiled, and it was the most mischievous expression I'd ever seen on a ghost. Fortunately, I have a plan. Aunt Evelina's plan was, well, it was insane. But then again, everything about my life had become insane, so why not lean into it? The ring will only transfer to you if the love between you and Alaric is true and freely acknowledged. But there's a catch. Of course there was a catch. There's always a catch. If you attempt the transfer and the love isn't genuine, if there's any doubt, any reservation, any small corner of your heart that isn't completely committed, then the ring's magic will backfire. Instead of freeing me and empowering Alaric, it will bind your soul to this castle in my place. So basically, I had to risk my literal soul on the possibility that what I felt for Alaric was real and that what he felt for me was equally genuine. No pressure at all. The night court arrived the next morning in a convoy of black cars that looked like they belonged in a spy movie. The council consisted of 7 ancient vampires who made Alaric look young and cheerful by comparison. They were led by Lady Morgana Vex, a vampire so old and powerful that plants withered when she walked past. They inspected the castle like they were appraising real estate, examined our engagement contract with magnifying glasses, and interviewed us separately about our relationship. My interview did not go well. "Miss Sterling," Lady Morgana said in a voice like broken glass, "you have been engaged to the Duke for exactly 23 days. Tell me about the moment you realized you loved him." I panicked. I couldn't tell her the truth, that I'd fallen in love gradually over shared meals and quiet conversations and the way he'd unconsciously started humming my favorite song. That sounded fake, even though it was real. So I said nothing, just sat there, silent, while she smiled like a shark. "I see," she said. "How very illuminating." Alaric's interview apparently went even worse. When he came out of the meeting, he looked like someone had told him his favorite puppy had died. "They don't believe us," he said quietly. "They think the engagement is a sham designed to help me retain my title illegitimately." "Well," I said, trying to keep my voice light, "it did start as a fake engagement." He looked at me with such pain in his eyes that I felt something crack in my chest. "Luna," he said softly, "I need to tell you something. Before tonight, before the ceremony, before you decide whether to go through with Evelina's plan." What he told me changed everything. When I bought this castle, It came with a collection of family papers and photographs from the previous owners. Among them was a photograph of the Sterling family taken around 1920. A woman with her daughter standing in front of a traveling library wagon. He pulled out an old photograph, sepia-toned and carefully preserved. A woman who looked like an older version of me holding hands with a little girl with dark hair and bright eyes. "Your grandmother and your mother," he said. I've had this photograph for 80 years, Luna, and I've been in love with your family's story for just as long. The traveling library, the way they brought books and knowledge to remote villages, the kindness in their faces. I stared at the photograph, then at him. "You're telling me you've been carrying around a picture of my family for 8 decades? He continued, "When I saw your advertisement response, when I saw your name, I wondered if it could be possible. And when you walked through those doors looking exactly like the little girl in the photograph grown up, he'd been in love with the idea of me since before I was born. Not me specifically, but my family, my heritage, the person he imagined that little girl would become. And somehow, impossibly, I'd become exactly that person. The ring knew," he said quietly. "From the moment you arrived, it's been trying to get to you. That's why it won't stay on Evelina's finger when you're around, why it slides away from you when you're not ready. It's been waiting for you."
The ritual began with Evelina holding out her hand, the emerald ring glowing with that eerie green light. It had grown brighter over the past few weeks, and now it was almost blinding. "Place your hand over mine, Luna," she instructed. "And Alaric, place yours over hers." Our hands layered together, mine between theirs, and immediately I felt it. This incredible warmth, like being wrapped in sunlight, followed by the strangest sensation, like electricity was running through my veins. "Now," Evelina said, "speak the truth of your hearts. No pretty words, no poetry, just the absolute truth of what you feel." Alaric went first, his voice low and steady. "Luna Sterling, I love you. Not because you fit into my world, but because you've made my world bigger. You've brought light into corners of my life that have been dark for centuries. You've made me believe that someone like me, something like me, could be worthy of love." The ring pulsed brighter. My turn. "Alaric Dragomir, I love you. I love your kindness, your dedication to protecting others, the way you make centuries-old supernatural politics sound like bedtime stories. I love that you've been carrying my family's photograph for 80 years, and I love that you're brave enough to risk everything for people who depend on you. I choose you. I choose this life, this castle, this magical, impossible world. I choose all of it." The ring blazed so bright, I had to close my eyes. And then it slipped off Evelina's finger like it had been waiting to do exactly that for 127 years. The moment it left her hand, everything changed. Evelina gasped, actually gasped, with breath she didn't have. And suddenly she looked solid, real, alive. The ring hovered in the air between us for a moment, spinning slowly before gently settling onto my finger. It fit perfectly, like it had been made for me. But the real magic was what happened to Alaric. The change was immediate and dramatic. Color flooded its face, his eyes brightened, and suddenly he looked less like a marble statue and more like a living man. The shadows that had always seemed to cling to him fell away, and when a beam of moonlight struck him through the great hall's windows, he didn't flinch or move away. He looked alive, fully, completely alive, in a way I hadn't realized he hadn't been before. "The sire bond is broken," Lady Morgana said, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked impressed. "The Duke has regained his full vampiric powers. The marriage is legitimate and binding." That's when the cheering started, 400 supernatural beings erupting in celebration, children laughing, adults crying with relief. The refugee families who had thought they might lose their home were safe. But I only had eyes for Alaric, who was looking at me like I was a miracle. "You did it," he whispered, lifting our joined hands to examine the ring. "You saved them all." "We did it," I corrected, and then he was kissing me. And let me tell you, kissing a vampire who's just regained his full powers is, well, it's an experience. There was this electric energy between us, like the air itself was charged with magic. I could taste starlight and midnight and something that was purely uniquely him. When we broke apart, the entire hall was watching us with huge grins. Even Lady Morgana looked like she might be fighting back a smile. But the biggest smile belonged to Aunt Evelina, who was practically glowing with happiness. "Finally," she exclaimed, clapping her hands together. "Do you know how exhausting it's been watching you two dance around each other for weeks?" That's when I realized something important. "Aunt Evelina," I said, "you're still here. I thought breaking the curse would let you move on." She laughed, a sound like silver bells. "Oh, darling, I'm not bound here anymore. The ring released me the moment it accepted you. I'm choosing to stay for the moment because I wouldn't miss this for the world." She gestured around the great hall where the celebration was still going strong. "Besides, someone needs to help plan a proper wedding. This little midnight ritual was lovely, but you'll need something much grander for society. I have ideas." The next few weeks were like living in a fairy tale. A gothic, supernatural, occasionally terrifying fairy tale, but a fairy tale nonetheless. First, there was the media frenzy. Supernatural society went absolutely wild when news of our successful bonding ritual spread. The headlines were ridiculous. "Duke's mysterious bride breaks century-old curse. Love conquers death. The Blackmore Castle miracle. From nobody to Duchess, the Cinderella story of the supernatural set." That last one was particularly annoying, but I had bigger things to worry about, like learning how to actually be a duchess. Turns out when you're married to a vampire duke who's just regained his full powers, there are certain adjustments to make. For starters, Alaric was different, not in a bad way. If anything, he was more himself than he'd been before, more confident, more powerful, more vibrant, but also more protective, more intense, and definitely more possessive. "It's a vampire thing," he explained, when I teased him about the way he'd position himself between me and any other supernatural beings we met. "I've just found my mate. My instincts are heightened." Mate. Not wife, not partner, mate. Which apparently meant something very specific in vampire culture. "You're bonded now," Aunt Evelina explained over tea in the library. "The ring didn't just transfer to you, dear. It connected your life force to his. You're still mortal, but you're protected by his vampiric energy. You'll live longer, heal faster, and you'll be able to sense each other's emotions and general well-being." Which explained why I'd been feeling oddly energetic lately, and why I could tell when Alaric was in a meeting 3 floors away just by the flutter of anxiety in my chest. It also explained the newfound supernatural abilities that kept surprising me. Like when I accidentally made all the flowers in the garden bloom at once because I was thinking about how happy I was, or when I somehow convinced a flock of ravens to stop dive-bombing the postman just by asking them nicely. "The ring enhances natural abilities," Alaric told me after I managed to understand what the castle's resident ghost cat was complaining about. Apparently, we'd moved his favorite napping cushion. But the biggest change was in our relationship itself. Living with someone you're deeply in love with is different from just dating them. You learn their habits, their quirks, the way they take their coffee, blood warm with a splash of actual coffee because apparently centuries of drinking blood gets boring. I learned that Alaric talks in his sleep in about 6 different languages, including some that have been dead for centuries. I learned that he has a secret weakness for terrible reality TV shows, and that he can play piano like he's channeling the spirits of long-dead composers. He learned that I'm a blanket hog, that I can't function before my second cup of tea, and that I have an unfortunate tendency to reorganize things when I'm nervous, which is why he came home one day to find I'd completely rearranged his 500-year-old library by genre instead of age. It's more efficient this way, I'd argued, and he just laughed and kissed my forehead. Whatever makes you happy, love. But it wasn't all domestic bliss and supernatural shenanigans. There were challenges, too. Like the other vampire families who weren't thrilled about a mortal being elevated to duchess status, or the supernatural media constantly trying to get photos of us, especially after rumors started spreading about my newfound abilities. And then there was the small matter of my former life. I had to quit my job, obviously. Hard to explain to your boss that you can't come in anymore because you've married a vampire duke and are now living in a haunted castle. I sold my flat, donated most of my belongings, and basically said goodbye to the mundane world I've known for 27 years. It should have been terrifying. In some ways it was, but mostly it felt like coming home. About a month after the bonding ceremony, I was in the castle library with Aunt Evelina, going through some old family documents she'd found in the archives. She'd become obsessed with tracing our family tree, determined to map out exactly how we were related. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a faded marriage certificate dated 1847. "Your great-great-great-grandmother, Margaret Sterling, married a man named Thomas Blackthorne." "Blackthorne?" I said, looking up from the genealogy chart I'd been working on. "That's your family name." She nodded excitedly. "Which means we're not just related through the maternal line, dear. The Sterlings and the Blackthorns have been connected for generations. No wonder the ring responded so strongly to you. It's been waiting for the bloodlines to reunite." So, not only had I accidentally married my ghost great-aunt's ex-fiancé, I'd also fulfilled some kind of ancient magical destiny by reuniting 2 families that had been connected for over a century. My life had become so ridiculous that I'd stopped being surprised by anything. That night, I told Alaric about Evelina's discovery. "So, we were destined to be together?" he asked, pulling me closer as we lay in our massive 4-poster bed. "Apparently," I said. "Does that bother you? That this might all be because of some magical family connection instead of just us?" He was quiet for a moment, then rolled over to look at me properly. "Luna," he said seriously, "I fell in love with you before I knew about any family connections. I fell in love with the way you argued with supernatural politics, with how you treated every ghost and vampire and fey creature like they were just normal people, deserving of respect. I fell in love with your terrible jokes and your organizational obsessions and the way you make tea like it's a sacred ritual. The magic brought us together, yes, but what we built, what we chose to build together, that's entirely us. And that's when I knew, with absolute certainty, that I'd made the right choice." Of course, Aunt Evelina wasn't kidding about the proper wedding. 3 months after our midnight bonding ceremony, we had what she called a wedding befitting the Duchess of Blackmore. It was, without exaggeration, the most extra event I have ever witnessed. Picture this, 300 guests, half of whom don't show up in photographs.
a ceremony held at sunset so both the daylight and nighttime supernatural communities could attend, flowers that literally glowed with their own light, a string quartet of ghosts playing music that made people cry just from the beauty of it, and me in a dress that had belonged to 5 generations of Blackthorn women, altered by a team of fey seamstresses who could manipulate fabric like it was water. The dress was incredible, layers of silk and lace and ivory and pale green with tiny emeralds sewn throughout that caught the light like captured stars. The train was so long it required 3 bridesmaids just to manage it, and the bodice was designed to perfectly showcase the family ring. My bridesmaids, by the way, were a vampire countess, a werewolf alpha, and Aunt Evelina, who had figured out how to appear solid enough to walk down the aisle. Alaric's groomsmen included a fey lord, his vampire cousin, and the castle's head of security, who was apparently a 400-year-old dragon in human form. You know, typical wedding party stuff. The ceremony itself was beautiful, but what I remember most is the reception. Imagine the most elegant party you've ever been to, then add champagne that sparkles with actual magic, a dance floor that hovers 3 feet off the ground, and a wedding cake that regenerates itself as people eat it. Also, my new mother-in-law is a 600-year-old vampire matriarch who kept giving me advice like, "Remember, dear, always keep iron jewelry handy for unexpected fey encounters, and never trust a ghost who won't tell you when they died." Practical stuff, really. But the best part of the whole evening was watching Alaric. He spent the entire night looking like he couldn't quite believe any of it was real. Every time someone congratulated him, every time he introduced me as his wife, every time he caught me looking at him across the room, he'd get this expression of wonder and joy that made my heart skip. During our first dance, to a song the Ghost Quartet played that had apparently been written for a Blackthorn wedding in 1743, he whispered, "6 months ago, I thought I'd spend eternity alone. Now look at us." "Now look at us," I agreed, spinning in my impossible dress under lights that defied physics.
But of course, happiness in a supernatural world is never without complications. About a week after the wedding, we got our first major challenge as a married couple. The London Supernatural Council requested a meeting with both of us, not just Alaric as Duke, but me as the new Duchess. Apparently, my little flower-blooming, raven-talking, ghost-cat understanding incidents had not gone unnoticed. "Mrs. Dragelmere," said Council Leader Thorne, a stern vampire who looked like he'd stepped out of a Dickens novel, "there have been reports of unusual magical activities centered around Blackmore Castle, specifically activity that seems to originate from you." They'd been monitoring me. Of course they had. "The ring you wear," continued another council member, "is one of the most powerful magical artifacts in existence. It's been dormant for over a century. Now it's not only active again, but it's amplifying abilities in a mortal human. This is unprecedented." Unprecedented. In supernatural speak, that usually means potentially dangerous and definitely worth keeping an eye on. But here's the thing. I wasn't the same person who'd answered that classified ad 6 months earlier. I'd spent months learning about supernatural politics, about the delicate balance between different communities, about the responsibilities that came with power. So when they asked me what I intended to do with my newfound abilities, I had an answer ready. "I want to help," I said simply, "the same way Alaric helps. This castle is a sanctuary, but there are supernatural beings all over Britain who need assistance, who need someone to advocate for them, who need resources and support.
I outlined my plan, use my empathic abilities and connection to the ring's power to expand the sanctuary network, create safe houses in other cities, establish a supernatural social services system. Basically, I concluded, I want to be a social worker for ghosts, vampires, fae, and werewolves. The council stared at me for a long moment. Then, Council Leader Thorne smiled, actually smiled, which according to Alaric was something that happened maybe once per century. "Mrs. Dragomir," he said, "I believe we can work together." And that's how I accidentally became the first supernatural social services coordinator for the United Kingdom. It turns out, when you're married to a powerful vampire duke and wearing a ring that's been absorbing magical energy for over a century, people take your social reform ideas pretty seriously. Within 2 months, we'd opened safe houses in Edinburgh, Manchester, and Cardiff. Within 6 months, we had a network of supernatural counselors helping newly turned vampires adjust to their new existence, and mediators helping resolve conflicts between different supernatural communities. It was exactly the kind of work I'd always wanted to do, just with a much more interesting client base than I'd ever imagined. The crisis started small, the way most disasters do. A few reports of supernatural beings going missing in London. Nothing dramatic at first. A young vampire who didn't come home from work, a fae artist who missed several scheduled exhibitions, a werewolf teacher who stopped showing up to classes. But the real test of our marriage came about 8 months after the wedding, when we faced our first real crisis together. In the mortal world, these might have been dismissed as people choosing to disappear, starting new lives elsewhere. But in supernatural society, disappearing without a word is almost unheard of. These communities are tight-knit. People don't just vanish. Alaric and I were in a study, going over the reports, when the pattern became clear. "Look at this," I said, spreading the missing person reports across his massive oak desk. "They're all young, all newly integrated into human society, and they all disappeared from the same general area of London." Alaric frowned, his finger tracing the location on a map. "South London, near the old warehouses by the Thames." "That's not a coincidence," I said. It wasn't. What we discovered over the next week of investigation was horrifying. Someone was systematically kidnapping young supernatural beings, specifically targeting those who had integrated into human society, who had jobs and lives in the mortal world. The kidnapper was human, a scientist named Dr. Marcus Whitmore, who had somehow discovered the existence of supernatural beings and decided they represented the next step in human evolution. He was running illegal experiments, trying to isolate and synthesize supernatural abilities. He was torturing them, cutting them open while they were alive to study their biology, draining vampire blood to see if it could extend human life, harvesting fae magic to power his equipment. When we found his laboratory, hidden in an abandoned warehouse, there were 12 supernatural beings chained up in cages like animals. I'll never forget the smell of that place. Fear and pain and disinfectant and something else. Something that made the ring on my finger burn with rage. "Luna," Alaric said quietly as we stood outside the warehouse. "You don't have to go in there. Let me handle this." But I could hear them. Through the ring's connection to supernatural energy, I could feel their terror, their desperation, their hope flickering like candles in the wind. "No," I said firmly. "They need to see that someone cares enough to come for them. They need to know they matter." What happened next? Well, it was the first time I really understood what I was capable of. We went in through the skylight. Alaric can fly, which is incredibly convenient for surprise attacks. Dr. Whitmore was there, with 2 assistants, standing over a young werewolf girl who couldn't have been more than 16. When he saw us, Whitmore smiled like he'd won the lottery. "Perfect timing," he said. not even slightly concerned about the very angry vampire who had just crashed through his roof. I was just wondering what would happen if I could study a bonded pair. The magical connection between you two must be extraordinary. That's when I lost my temper. And when someone wearing a centuries-old magical artifact loses their temper, things get interesting. The ring flared with green light so bright it was like having a star on my finger. Every piece of metal in the laboratory, the cages, the surgical instruments, the chains, suddenly glowed red hot. The locks on all 12 cages simply melted. Dr. Whitmore and his assistants collapsed, clutching their heads and screaming. Later, Alaric told me that what I'd done was force them to experience every moment of pain they'd inflicted on their victims, all at once.
The rescued supernatural beings were free. Their captors were incapacitated. And I was standing in the middle of it all, feeling like I'd been struck by lightning. "Remind me," Alaric said, looking around at the destruction with a mixture of pride and amazement, "never to make you truly angry." The aftermath was complicated. We couldn't exactly call the police. "Hello, officer, we'd like to report illegal experiments on vampires and werewolves." Wasn't going to go over well, so the Supernatural Council handled it their way. Dr. Whitmore and his assistants were given modified memories and relocated to different countries with new identities. The laboratory was destroyed. The victims were given the best medical care Supernatural Society could provide. But the real impact was on me. "You saved them," said Sarah, the young werewolf girl, when I visited her in the Supernatural Hospital a few days later. "You came for us when no one else would." That's when I realized something important about my new life, my new abilities, my new responsibilities. I wasn't just Alaric's wife or the Duchess of Blackmore or even the Supernatural Social Services Coordinator. I was someone who could make a difference in the lives of beings who had no one else to protect them. The rescue operation changed how both supernatural and human communities saw me. Word spread quickly through Supernatural Society about the human Duchess who had single-handedly freed 12 captives and brought down a rogue scientist. Suddenly, instead of being seen as Alaric's mortal wife who'd gotten lucky with a magical ring, I was seen as a force to be reckoned with in my own right. The marriage dynamic shifted too, in the best possible way. "We're partners now," Alaric said that night as we sat by the fire in our bedroom, both still processing what had happened. "True partners. I don't have to protect you anymore. We protect each other." "Is that okay with you?" I asked, because I knew how hard it could be for protective vampire instincts to adjust to having an equally powerful mate. He smiled and pulled me closer. "Luna, watching you save those people, seeing you use your power to protect others, I've never been more attracted to you in my life." Which led to a very pleasant evening, let me tell you. But the crisis had lasting effects beyond just our relationship. The Supernatural Council officially recognized me as a full member, with voting rights and everything. The Safe House network expanded rapidly as more communities requested protection and resources. And I started getting calls from supernatural beings all over Europe who had heard about the Duchess who saves people. My quiet life as a fake fiancé turned real wife had somehow evolved into being an international supernatural rights advocate. You know what the funny thing is? 6 months before all of this started, I thought my biggest problem was not being able to afford rent. I thought I was nobody special, just someone who cleaned up other people's broken dreams for a living. Now I was someone with actual power, real influence, the ability to change lives and protect people who desperately needed protection. And it all started with answering a classified ad for a fake engagement. So here we are, 1 year later. I'm sitting in the same library where I first met Aunt Avelina, though she's moved on now, finally free to explore whatever comes after life, though she still visits every Tuesday for tea and gossip. The castle is busier than ever. We're currently housing 43 supernatural refugees, including a family of Selkies whose coastal home was destroyed by climate change, and a group of young vampires who fled persecution in Eastern Europe. Our network has expanded to cover most of Western Europe, and I've been invited to speak at the International Supernatural Rights Conference next month. Me, the girl who used to hide behind dusty wedding dresses, giving speeches to rooms full of centuries-old supernatural leaders. Alaric is thriving, with his full powers restored and a purpose beyond just maintaining his title. He's become the supernatural community's unofficial ambassador to the human world. He's currently working with the British government, very discreetly, to establish legal protections for supernatural beings. We make a good team, it turns out. He handles the politics and diplomacy. I handle the social services and crisis intervention. He charms them with centuries of experience and aristocratic breeding. I help them with my empathic abilities and complete lack of supernatural prejudice. And the physical side of being bonded to a vampire duke? Let's just say the romance novels don't do it justice. But the best part isn't the magic or the powers or even the incredible sex. It's the partnership. Having someone who trusts you completely, who supports your wildest ideas, who's proud of your accomplishments, even when they overshadow his own. When I told him I wanted to establish a supernatural legal aid clinic, he didn't ask if I was sure or suggest I start smaller. He just asked what I needed and started making phone calls. When he decided he wanted to write a book about supernatural history for human readers, carefully edited to protect community secrets, I didn't worry about whether it would expose us. I just asked how I could help with the research. Which brings me to the big news, the reason I'm really recording this whole crazy story. We got the call this morning. The European Supernatural Council has approved our proposal for the Blackmore Institute, a full university for supernatural beings who want to integrate into human society while maintaining their cultural identities. Classes in everything from modern technology for immortals to legal rights and responsibilities for shapeshifters to cross-cultural communication between supernatural species. It'll be based here at the castle, with satellite campuses in major cities across Europe. We're expecting our first class of students next fall, about 200 supernatural beings from dozens of different communities. But the biggest news is something I haven't even told Alaric yet. This morning, along with the university approval, I got a visit from someone very special, an angel. An actual angel with wings and everything, who serves as a messenger for what she called the powers that govern these things. She had some very interesting information about the ring I'm wearing. Apparently, the Blackthorn Emerald isn't just a magical artifact that enhances abilities and bonds souls. It's what's called a legacy stone, a piece of crystallized destiny that appears when the universe needs specific changes to be made. The ring chose me not just because I was compatible with Alaric or because our families were connected, but because the supernatural world needed someone exactly like me, with exactly my combination of abilities and attitudes at exactly this moment in history. Someone human enough to bridge the gap between worlds, but powerful enough to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Someone with the empathy to understand different perspectives, but the strength to fight for what's right. The angel told me that there are only 7 legacy stones in existence, and they only activate during times of major supernatural upheaval. But last time one was active was during the Salem witch trials. She also told me that the ring's magic is evolving, that as the supernatural world changes and grows, my abilities will change and grow with it. That this story, our story, is really just the beginning.
You and your bonded mate are the first of a new kind of partnership, human and supernatural, working together not just for love, but for the future of both your worlds. So that's where we are. Alaric and I, accidentally married, intentionally bonded, apparently destined to help reshape the relationship between the supernatural and human worlds. It's terrifying and exhilarating and completely insane.
But you know what? I wouldn't change any of it. A year ago, I was Luna Sterling, broke antiquarian with a specialty in cursed bridal wear and no prospects for the future. Today, I'm Luna Dragomir, Duchess of Blackmore, Supernatural Social Services Coordinator for Europe, wearer of a legacy stone, and wife to the most wonderful man in any world, mortal or otherwise. Oh, and apparently, according to Aunt Evelina's latest genealogy research, I'm also distantly related to Merlin, which explains a lot, actually. So if you're out there thinking your life is stuck, that you're nobody special, that nothing exciting will ever happen to you, well, maybe keep an eye on the classified ads. You never know what kind of adventure might be waiting. Just maybe do a little more research than I did before you agree to fake marry a mysterious duke. Trust me on that one. But if you do find yourself accidentally married to a vampire and wearing a magical ring that makes you more powerful than you ever imagined possible, embrace it. Trust yourself. The universe has a funny way of giving us exactly what we need, even when we don't know we need it. And sometimes what we need is a love story so impossible, so magical, so completely ridiculous that it changes not just our lives, but the entire world around us. Oh, that's Alaric coming back from his meeting with the council. I should probably tell him about the angel visit and the legacy stone thing, and the fact that we're apparently cosmic agents of supernatural change. Although, knowing him, he'll just smile and ask if I want tea while we discuss how to reshape the balance of power between two worlds. Did I mention I love my ridiculous, wonderful, impossible life? Luna, love, you'll never believe what the council proposed for the new university curriculum. And that's my cue. This is Luna Dragomir, signing off from the most magical place in the world. Actually, darling, I have some news that might top whatever the council said.
If you want to get more paranormal stories like this, you hit the subscribe button, comment, and share. Also tell us on the comments which part resonates with you.